Okay, then I start with a brief introduction. So, hi everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Thomas Nail. Thomas earned his bachelor in philosophy at the University of North Texas and then went on to complete his PhD in philosophy at the University of Oregon in 2011. He currently holds the title of Distinguished Scholar and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Denver. And Thomas' research agenda is broad, dynamic, and deeply original. He works at the intersections of philosophy, of movement, critical theory, European philosophy, new materialism, and political philosophy. Over the years, he has authored numerous books. Among them are The Figure of the Migrant, Theory of the Border, Theory of the Earth, Marx in Motion, The Philosophy of Movement, the three-volume Lucretius 1, 2, and 3, and Being and Motion. One little anecdote I found rather amusing. When I was preparing this introduction, I assumed from the sheer number of his book that Thomas must be around 70 years old. It turns out, after doing a bit of online digging, that he's around 45, so that's quite impressive. Such a wide range of ideas and projects at a relatively young age. So, for our SFB project, focusing on the production of migration, organized around the clusters of figures and infrastructures and spaces, Thomas' work is particularly relevant. His book, The Figure of the Migrant, offered one of the important conceptual foundations of our thinking in the figures cluster. So it's very fitting and exciting that we have him with us today. So let me end by saying we are delighted to welcome you, Thomas, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. That was really nice. I only sent Julia like two sentences to say about me, so that was very kind to say all those things and those funny things. I appreciate that. And thank you all. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk. I wish I could be there with you. I know Zoom talks, they just are what they are, but at least we can be here together in some way. And I mean, the center that you all are, it's just amazing to, that so many migration scholars are working together. This field is so interdisciplinary. I just always feel overwhelmed and lost by it because there's so many different angles to come at it with. And keeping up with contemporary immigration politics around the world is just, it's an overwhelming prospect. I'm teaching a class on migration next quarter, and just the damage control of the Trump administration alone is like the first few weeks are just here's what happened, here's what's going on. Let's get up to date on this. Anyway, thank you all so much. I should really set a timer so I don't go over my time. So I guess it's stopping at the hour, right? And then we'll pause for questions at the hour. So yeah, thank you for coming. The title of my talk is The Figure of the Migrant. I'm just putting colon 10 years on. It's crazy that it's been 10 years since I published that book, The Figure of the Migrant, in 2015. I had been doing work starting in about 2009 and 2010 were years that I was in Toronto and Montreal working with the migrant justice group No One Is Illegal. And that's sort of how I got into all of this stuff. But it's just amazing the things that have happened in just 10 years in migration. And I had no sense of this at the time when I was really digging deep into this starting in 2010. In my mind, it was already like migration was just this crazy thing that was happening, and I was keeping track of the sort of annual deaths of migrants crossing the US-Mexico border and the Mediterranean. And to me, it was a huge thing that I think was outsized in importance relative to my discipline in political philosophy, which was what I was, writing my dissertation on at the time. And that just it really bothered me that political philosophers had never really taken migration or borders very seriously. And I know that's not the case anymore today, but in 2010, there was a very small literature review that you could do quite easily on political theories of migration and borders. Now, obviously, in sociology and demography and statistics, and there, there's that studies of migration are much older, but I think philosophers have been fairly late to the game, and so publishing my book in 2015, coming out of spending a really wonderful year where I was just kind of living my dream, where I got a Fulbright scholarship. So not a lot of money, but it's enough to pay to eat and have a place to stay and just read political theory and do political activism all day, and not have to do anything else. And that was a very special time. But it was a time that I began the project really looking at the history of migration and looking at, and just being in Toronto with all of these disciplines of critical security studies and sociology and, all of these disciplines that were thinking about migration. They had a migration center there, not quite as big as what you all are up to. So, but, you get a sense of the just how many different ways and aspects there are to migration. Very shortly, like just let me say like what I want to try to do in the talk. So I have now about 50 minutes, and in my goal here is to just give you a little just introduction of like why I got into this, like, and what the kind of starting orientation was and how it just sort of exploded into a lifelong project that I think I just won't ever be able to finish. As much as I've written, I do not feel that the end is in sight on this one. And then sort of look at three big sort of takeaways. One, from the figure of the migrant. I know some of you have read my work, and thank you so much for like taking the time to read it and engage with it. So I'll be quick somewhat on the summary of what I take to be the main points about the figure of the migrant book. And then different perspective on migration, scale, both in space and time, from my book Theory of the Earth in 2021. So I returned to the theme of migration there. And then in one of my latest books from 2024 called The Philosophy of Movement, where I returned to migration again, a different sense of scale and time. So my contribution today will be a bit more probably like scale wise larger than many of the talks that are given. So this is my little piece, is thinking about migration in a really large framework. It's not the only way to do it, but it is an interesting way to really think about migration on a much bigger scale of space and time. So those are the three pieces. Some of it I'm just going to summarize, like this first part I'm just going to try to verbally summarize, and then the second part I'll read a bit of text, because the argument and the quotes are quite nice if I can get them all together. So the main starting point that I entered into the field of migration studies was, so I'm a trained philosopher. I was doing my degree in philosophy. And I remember just being really put off by political philosophers thinking of it as a secondary migration, as like this undesirable secondary aspect of political theory, of like, well, look, John Rawls, in the ideal society, nobody would want to leave. So, migration is just for him. It's like it's just not a thing that he thinks about. Borders, again, same kind of situation. And Rawls has been, widely criticized for those ideas. So part of my perspective, or what I wanted to do with the project, was start with migration, like from the Neolithic, and then look at the history of world migration as it develops over human history. And try to think about what it would be to develop a political theory that started from the perspective that humans have always been moving. You cannot fully stop them from moving, and that their movement, and this was the kind of key thesis of both Theory of the Border and Figure of the Migrant, is that the movement is constitutive, meaning that it's movement and human mobility and migration that produce the societies. Okay. And then once the societies emerge and become fairly stable, they then become, they work back upon the flows of migration to shape them and move them and prohibit them and all these things. But that migration and human movement are what make those societies possible in the first place. So in the study, like from that orientation, the figure of the migrant sort of tracks. Speaking of the figures here that you all are thinking about, and I'm sure there's lots of different figures and ways to think about these. From a historical perspective, I looked at 4 figures that kind of track a larger history of migration. The first one from the Neolithic period was the nomad. That was the figure that, as you begin to see Neolithic settlements, the development of sedentary agriculture. Again, that's a complicated story, but let's just say over thousands of years, this is a slow and diverse process that happens. It also produces an interesting kind of distinction where you get first a kind of centripetal from the outside in, a contraction and sedimentation of humans into, you know, increasingly sedentary societies. But then once you do that, you have people that are on the periphery that don't do that. And the name for these historically are nomads. So they're sort of produced by this emergence of a more sedimented, defined territory. The more you increase that, the more you end up locating an external site of people who are not accumulated. The second stage, beginning around 5000 BCE to 5000 CE. I mean, that's a big period of time, I know, but the ancient world, for lack of a better word, I'm thinking here of just the ancient Eurasian world, is a figure of the migrant produced by the increasing, again, dynamic, differential geography and so on, but that the rise and emergence of empires, states, cities, ends up doing something quite different than was happening in the Neolithic period, which is not only consolidating a territory, but then having a kind of central organizing force that then organizes that territory. That is, I call the kind of centrifugal, meaning that it starts from the center. You can think of the king, the emperor, centralized administration. Even in the case of Greek city-states, you have a kind of centralized legal, political system that then codifies the territory, and produces this other figure, which Aristotle, I mean, among others, but Aristotle famously calls the barbarian. So that barbarian is just the name for everybody who's not only not part of that for Aristotle, but who can't be part of it at all. Actually, that is because the barbarians, which is to say non-Greek people, they don't have the logos. Like they can't, not only do they can't speak Greek, but because Greek is not just another language, it's the language of reason. It is connected to the way we know being, the way that we are able to engage in politics, that's the language that's required. So the barbarian is the one who is excluded from political participation, and is by nature a slave, Aristotle says. But anyway, that's the point, is that's the political dimension of that exclusion. So territorial first in the Neolithic, and then the dominant form becomes political exclusion. And then in the feudal period, we have the emergence of this kind of uniquely kind of dominant figure of the vagabond, who is a kind of legal, like is a legal term. The vagabond is one who doesn't have a master, who has been essentially defined by a legal terminology. So it's a very particular kind of juridical exclusion, that vagabonds don't fit into the legal codifications. And then during the modern period, the name there, again, we're talking about post 1500 CE, the proletariat. In a wide sense, the proletariat is sort of just meant to capture this new figure of the migrant whose determination is kind of economic, or at least the emphasis is economic, meaning that we're dealing with a kind of, instead of a tension between different juridical feudal powers, and that is the understanding of law in the feudal period, is that you have the law is around the owner of the land, the lord. So the lord, wherever he goes, it's like the law just kind of follows him. It's not tied strictly to the territory. It's bound to the lord himself, and to his obedient or disobedient serfs, whether, and so vagabonds, you can see, are a violation and an exclusion of that particular legal code. In any case, back to the proletariat, the under the sort of, in the modern period with the rise of capitalism, you get a really different kind of dominant social structure that's based on a like sort of elasticity of markets. Nobody knows what a market will do. Will it rise? Will it fall? It's not like a feudal lord who makes decisions that sort of are direct, or a sovereign whose word is just law. But markets, they organize massive amounts of humans, nation states, and so on, but they are very unpredictable in terms of where certain people are needed at certain times. And so as markets expand and contract in this sort of elastic way, it produces this new figure who has to move around to follow those flows of capital. Now, all of those, and this is the last point I'll make about figure of the migrant, all of those patterns, so that I was looking at in history, and sort of tracking these patterns of motion that produce these figures of migration. Today, they're sort of all there. The dominant one, I think, is still the capitalist form of motion, but these older ones never fully go away. They're still there. And they persist, but we have to look at geographies and different times and places to see that all these patterns and all these figures are still sort of co-present. Now, we could probably look at different, sub-figures and so on, but those are the main ones that I outlined. So I'm going to move now. So that's sort of at one scale, the scale of human, a very particular human history, starting with the Neolithic, mainly focused on Eurasia. So in the next book, Theory of the Earth, I sort of panned out a bit more, thinking about migration and its figures in a broader way as a planetary feature, meaning it's not that humans aren't the only migrants on this planet. Insects, birds, animals, plants, water, nitrogen. I mean, we could really look at the migration of all kinds of things on the planet. And that was the perspective that I looked at the Earth from when I wrote this book. And it has important implications too for rethinking what today, how are migrants being mobilized, and how is that related to climate change? This section I'm going to read to you, and I hate to tell you, it's a bit darker. It's in spirit. It's a little pessimistic about the situation, but it just happens to be it's still true, but it's anyway. I'm going to start reading. Everything seems to be moving faster these days. Work and personal life feel rushed and blurred together. News and information from around the world stream into our brains so rapidly it makes us feel restless, impatient, anxious. High-speed global transportation systems allow people and materials to travel longer distances, more frequently and faster than ever before. Most of the objects around us probably came from a dozen places thousands of miles away. Even glaciers are on the move due to climate change. We can now see them flow and recede like roaring rivers in a matter of minutes with the aid of time-lapse photography. Unfortunately, these melting glaciers are causing sea levels to rise more quickly today than the previous 2,700 years, putting millions of people at risk and forcing mass migration. Indeed, according to a report by the United Nations International Organization of Migration, climate change will contribute to a possible doubling of international migration over the next 40 years. We live in an epoch of movement where enormous numbers of people migrate because of environmental, economic, and political instability caused by climate change and global capitalism. The result is that today there are already more than 1 billion regional international migrants. Moreover, with each new decade, the percentage of migrants in the total population continues to rise. By 2050, demographers expect 2 billion more people to migrate to urban centers worldwide. And it's not just humans that are on the move. By destroying nearly all wild animals and their habitats, that sounds dramatic, but unfortunately, it's actually true that it is a huge percentage. When we look at different species, it varies, but we're talking 70s, 80% of many species of animals on the planet and plants. Humans are now forcing half of the remaining plant and animal species on the planet into migration. That's an actual, like, you can't see the footnotes here, but there's footnote to an article showing that half the animals on the planet and plants are migrating because of climate change. So this is not just humans. In short, the 21st century is witness to the largest mass migration event of humans, plants, animals, and objects in human history. We could also probably talk, although this is outside the purview of human or even animal migration, just thinking about this age that elsewhere I've called the Kenocene. I'm not attached to it in any big way, but I like all the scenes. They all get at something of this moment. But the Kenocene is just trying to articulate this crazy moment on this planet that I don't think that there's ever been a time in geological history where this much just physical stuff is moving around this much. That there would be just at this point, I've lost track, but it's tens of thousands, certainly, of just debris that's like floating around the low Earth orbit, planet. So there's like all of this material just floating around. There's like a geological strata of metal from exploded rock capsules and all kinds of other stuff, human debris floating around the planet. So not just on the planet, but in the air, and then even into space, things are moving around. But the centuries-long attempt to master planetary movement is falling apart. We now live in a nearly constant state of social, economic, and ecological instability. If the Earth were a pot of water, it would be boiling with turbulence. The expectation that human mobility will conform to a model of states, borders, and citizenship is causing immense suffering. Furthermore, for thousands of years, many human groups have assumed that Earth systems are fundamentally stable, knowable, and manageable. But this is turning out to not be true. A few dominant human groups have destabilized planetary movement by treating the world as a collection of discrete and interchangeable entities and commodities that follow predictable laws of motion. And now, in order to manage and control planetary mobility, the world is becoming even more bordered. 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan sort of announced at the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, that this is be an age where the borders are falling, and and it wasn't actually. There are now 15 more borders around the world than there are. Or sorry, at the time there were 15 borders around the world. Now there's 77. So not a less bordered world, a massively more bordered world than there was. On the face of it, might look like a catastrophic failure for liberal capitalism, but unfortunately, it's been an enormous success story. This is the dark part, okay, is just that all of these horrible things seem like they should have terrible consequences, but they've actually resulted in absolutely enormous growing profits. But unfortunately, it's become a success. And in this, the lamentable story I'm sharing with you today, critical scholars often say that migration, climate change, and things like COVID were in the interterm between pandemics, are the results of capitalism. But what I would like to say today is that contemporary capitalism is also the result of migration, climate change, and for COVID, you will have to wait to the next pandemic. But one of the darker thoughts is about COVID and the pandemic, but I'll skip over that. They produce, and this is the bigger picture, a kind of larger feedback system, a global circulation that not only is feeding on forced migration, but is really actively involved in both producing it and feeding off of it and profiting off the whole process. So this is what I've called the climate migration industrial complex. It's a mouthful, but I think it gets the idea across that it's a massive world system. It's not accidental. Climate change is not some kind of like unfortunate situation that needs to be rectified. I mean, from the perspective of capital, it's actually really a very wonderful thing that increases the displacement of migrants and their hyper-exploitation. So it's not surprising that over the past 2 decades, we have also seen a rise of increasingly powerful global climate security market. So this is like an important thing. We're talking about $742 billion is the estimated value. And that was like I think that was for 2024. But this is one of the fastest growing and largest markets in the world is the security market. So these are private companies that travel around the world building borders. You probably know for the U.S.-Mexico, for Israel, at the Israeli border fence, they will go anywhere, build security cameras, wall infrastructure. So it's a lot of the same technology, drones, and so on. So it's both partly about political and economic migration, but also part of the security is securing countries and territories in the face and preparing them for climate change. So climate change and migration are being sort of brought together in the way that this global security market has advanced. So the industry is composed of private companies who profit by securing nation states from the effects of climate-related events, including migration. This includes private detention centers, border construction companies, surveillance technology consultants, and developers, deportation and transportation contractors, and a growing army of other subcontractors profiting from insecurity more broadly. In other words, the insecurity is that's the whole point. Sustaining a condition of insecurity allows for the security market to endlessly profit. It's not really in their interest to produce security, although that is of course, that's what they say. They're trying to produce security. That's just not true. What they really are producing is insecurity I mean, if they produced security, they'd be undermining their own market, and that would be silly from their perspective. The question is how to sustain and draw out insecurity. And that includes climate insecurity. So every feature of ecological and social instability is an opportunity for profit. For example, even when security measures fail, quote, fail, and migrants cross the border illegally or remain beyond their visas to live without status as criminals, there's an entire wing of private companies paid to hunt them down, detain them, deport them just across the border, where they can return the migrants and begin the cycle all over again. Each step in the crimmigration process now has its own cottage industry and dedicated army of lobbyists to perpetuate the laws that support it. I'm sure you all know this about the detention industrial complex. It's a massive lobby project, and they are very much interested not in keeping people forever, but releasing them, keeping them for as long as they can, and then releasing them so they can apprehend them again. And that's how you sustain a market. Let's talk about the immigration industrial complex first, and then see how it connects to climate change. Here is the paradoxical sounding backbone of the migrant industrial complex in a nutshell. When I tell my students that migration also increases GDP, that most migrants pay taxes, aren't criminals, and generally dispel all the myths they've heard, they then ask, but if migrants are so good, not that they should be exploited for their goodness, mind you, why do so many people in the US want to remove them? On the one hand, capitalists want to grow the economy with migrant labor. Any honest economist will tell you that. But there's the catch. The capitalists like migrant labor because it's cheap, exploitable, and in this way increases profits. On the other hand, right-wing nationalists and politicians say they want to deport all undocumented migrants. Now, if these anti-immigration folks actually got their wish, they would destroy their own economy. So this is the dilemma. Capitalists want to expand the economy, but anti-immigration folks don't want migrants in the country. Enter the Trump solution. Not that he's absolutely unique here, but it is at least his solution, as well as others. Pro-economy, anti-immigrant. Old wine, new bottle. On the one hand, migrant labor is strategically criminalized and devalorized by xenophobic policies and national populism. And with the other, it's securitized and hyper-exploited by the capitalist economy. It's a win-win situation for right-wing capitalists, which, again, the Donald Trump is right there. He's got the right distribution of xenophobia and sort of right-wing values, as well as being himself a capitalist. But a crucial element is missing. What will continue to compel migrants to leave their homes around the world and come to work as exploited criminals in an increasingly xenophobic country? Not a winning prospect. How can you produce that formula? This is where the figure of the climate migrant comes in. What we call climate migrants, or quote climate refugees, are not victims of merely natural disasters, because climate change is not strictly a natural process. It is also highly political. The causes of climate-related migration are disproportionately produced by rich Western countries, and the effects are disproportionately suffered by poorer countries. The circumstances that determine who is forced to migrate are also influenced by the history of colonialism, global inequality, and the same conditions that have propelled economic migration for decades. In short, the fact that climate change benefits the perpetrators of climate destruction by producing an increasing supply of desperate, criminalized, physically and economically displaced laborers is no coincidence. In fact, it is the key to the Trump solution. Another key is the use of climate change to acquire new land. When people are forced to migrate out of a territory, or when frozen territories thaw, new lands, waters, and forests become open to extractive industries like mining, drilling, fishing, logging. Trump's ridiculous bid to buy the thawing territory of Greenland for its oil and gas reserves is one example of this. We should expect to see more of this happening as the climate changes and new territories are opened, others are abandoned. Climate-stricken urban areas open up new real estate markets, as the gentrification of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina illustrated. But again, we could look at cases all over the world where climate-related disasters end up actually basically paving a way for gentrification and real estate markets. We could also think here of, Trump's recent well, I guess it's not that recent, but recent enough aspirations that, to turn the Gaza Strip into like a real estate kind of what does he say, the I forget exactly what the expression was, basically a resort. In other words, climate change may not mean the end of capitalism, but rather could actually signal its resurgence from current falling rates of ecological profit, meaning that during colonialism, everything and everyone that could be easily appropriated, oil, slaves, old growth forest, etc., was gobbled up. Things could just be stolen during colonialism. But the workers who are left now today, and the environment that's left today, there are more protections under post-colonial demands for more money, more rights, and so on. The minerals left are more expensive to extract. Oil, for instance, in the United States, it's there. It's just going to take a lot more money to get to it. This is why capitalists have increasingly retreated to financial speculation, again, starting in the 70s, and now to monetizing their own crises. So whether that's a pandemic or whether that's climate change, the monetization on these catastrophes is not an accident. The point is that it had become quite difficult for capitalists to make profit. And this is having all of these crises, ecological, migratory. It is a really incredible way to revitalize capitalist economy. If only there were new ways, the capitalist dreams, to kickstart the economy and cheaply dislodge huge numbers of people from their land, devalorize their labor, and then appropriate that labor, and extremely cheaply. In other words, if climate change did not exist, capitalism would have to create it. Luckily for the capitalists, it does exist because they did create it. Climate migrants now, from what we might call, adding to Karl Marx's term, quote, a disposable climate labor army. So Marx in Capital calls it the surplus labor army. Here we could talk about a kind of climate labor army, conscripted out of a standing reserve of global poverty from wherever the next climate-related disaster strikes, and deployed wherever capitalism demands precarious, securitized, and criminalized labor to be exploited. Okay, that's the end of that section. That was like a lot of thoughts that sort of resulted out of the Theory of the Earth book in 2021, which was just about thinking about migration as a much larger kind of planetary system, and the way that it intersects with planetary, in this case, destruction or destabilization. The next section, I'll just preface a little bit. So this is the most recent book. It's called The Philosophy of Movement in Introduction in 2024. This was like, I returned again here to thinking about migration. I'm sorry if this is all a lot. I mean, it's like 10 years on, but it's like 10 years of things I've tried to consolidate the theses or just the crystals of the big ideas from thinking about migration over the last decade. This is the third piece, which is really sort of thinking about the deeper history of migration. So slightly different in tone and approach, looking before the Neolithic. So I started to wonder, yes, okay, we have this history of societies, they produce these figures, but what were things like prior to that? What was going on in the Pleistocene? What can we make of hunter, pre Holocene or even sort of transitionary hunter-gatherer societies and their relationship to migration? So that's this section. This is also, part of a larger project that I haven't said a lot here, but maybe you all have seen some of the other work I've done on the philosophy of what I call the philosophy of movement. To me, that the philosophy of movement was just something that actually came out of the work on migration. I started looking at migrants, and then I realized the whole reason why in this sort of Euro-Western tradition, migrants had been treated the way they were, it was not a one-off. It was not just political, it was actually aesthetic, scientific, ontological. It was part of a whole worldview that made sense of a certain kind of figure of the migrant. So it has all these other implications. So I spent just like a decade looking at all those other areas, looking at history of science and aesthetics and art and so on. the other big thing that I realized later on after the figure of the migrant is that those patterns that I was originally seeing in the book, The Figure of the Migrant, were actually um, they're patterns for these other areas, but they were also patterns for the larger Earth history, which was not something I expected to find. I have to admit that that was a big surprise, and that those patterns actually. So I mentioned it before: centripetal, gathering together, and centrifugal, spreading out. These patterns really are much more widespread. And they sort of fit together in an interesting way that I realized in this last project. I mean, kind of starting with theory of the Earth, but really putting it all together, that these patterns actually happen across domains: politics, art, science, ontology, so on, but then also happen across scales. So whether we're thinking about like sort of cosmic, terrestrial, social, these and there's these patterns like that I was finding, these actually fit together in a way that makes a lot of sense. Because they turn out that they fit together in this kind of branching pattern. So if you imagine a tree, the way a tree works, like it's the movement of a tree, is that it has this sort of centripetal movement of we could just say here of matter or energy coming together to form something like a trunk. And then from that trunk, it's a sort of a central point, right, that rises up, and then it spreads outward from that central trunk region. And then the branches have this very, careful balance of weight. The main branches distribute the weight so the tree doesn't fall over and it can respond to wind and all kinds of things. But there's a kind of tensional balance of those main branches of the tree. And then at the very tips of the tree are the leaves, the most elastic, flexible leaves that kind of, they come, they go, they change color. They're the most sort of mutable aspects of the tree. So we have all of these patterns together. And the reason they're all connected is because this is an optimal way for energy to spread out from high concentrations of energy. Sorry to get into physics, but my brain doesn't stay very disciplinary confined here. Is that, the tree dissipates energy in a very optimal way. And you see these patterns all over the place in rivers, in mountains and valleys, in the distribution of dark matter in the cosmos, in the way that plants and cells grow. These branching patterns are ways to take a high concentration, just if you think about the Big Bang as a high concentration of energy, and then to spread it out to a lower concentration. And it turns out that one of the recurring optimal ways that the universe does that is this branching pattern. So the fact, I mean, in some ways it's sort of obvious, although I have to say that I really did think like, well, yeah, there's nature, but then humans surely do something different, don't they? Like, aren't we, why should human society be, so different than nature? If you think about this, like why is it when we do things, we expect them to not be like the rest of natural processes? Why would we be exempt from entropy? No, human societies over time and space are not exempt from entropy. Their societies, their cities. When you look at cities, I mean, you think, well, this doesn't look like nature at all. But if you pan out and you fly over a city, you can see that it's this branchy, tendrilled, and there's lots of studies. There's a whole book called Fractal Cities that just looks at the fractal structures of cities, but also it's the pipelines, the electrical lines, like water, sewage. The way that the city grows is very much like an organism. All of this to say that these patterns over human history of migration and society are part of larger planetary and tropic systems that do play a role. Okay, back to the Paleolithic. I'm going to read you just like it's a shorter section about some of the interesting findings recently about Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies. Bear with me. I told you it was going to be a big scale. We're going from the cosmos to, really far back in time and space. But it's interesting to think about all of the ways, and importantly, migration itself. There was a time where things were quite different than what we usually think of, even in terms of human history, which often starts at the Neolithic. But if we start it before that, we do see something quite different. Recent evidence suggests that many hunter-gatherers did not have one fixed form of society, but alternated between several distinct patterns of motion. Hunter-gatherers followed the migrations of woolly mammoth, steppe bison, reindeer, as well as seasonal patterns of fish runs and nut harvests. During the late summer and fall, many groups would gather centripetally, to a single location to share the abundance of wild foods and engage in complex rituals, make art and sometimes monuments, and trade minerals. I mean, you know about this, right? Lots of these archaeological studies are finding wild, like monumental architecture, things that we think only states and massively centralized societies could produce, have turned out to be produced by hunter-gatherers who didn't even live there. Göbekli Tepe is the really famous one we've known for a while, but we keep finding more and more of these sites that are sort of challenging how we've thought about what certain societies are capable of. So these sites were also seasonal sites of trading minerals, shells, and furs, and we have all these evidence now. Evidence of these seasonal events can be found in places in Eastern Europe, the great rock shelters of the French Perigord in Western Europe. Archaeologists, sorry, I have all the citations. If you want the paper, I can give them to you here. But archaeologists have also shown that these seasonal patterns are behind the impressive megalith structures of Göbekli Tepe, located in modern-day Turkey, inhabited from 9,500 BCE to 8,000 BCE, which is much older than we find any other megalithic kind of monumental architecture. Here, small distinct groups of foragers gathered from around the periphery to a single location to process massive quantities of nuts, cereals, grasses, meats for an enormous feast. In this seasonal festival, we have archaeological evidence for these festivals. They would construct enormous temporary structures requiring massive amounts of organized labor, and then fill them in with the leftovers from the feast, and again spread out centrifugally. So they gathered together centripetally at a seasonal moment. Crazy amounts of social organization must have been happening there to probably some centrifugal organization. It wasn't just arbitrary, spontaneous, whatever. Probably there were central directors organizing this activity, and then they spread back out again to the periphery. After the season is over, after the feasting is done, they separate back out into hunting groups. Something similar happened later at Stonehenge in Britain between 3000 and 2000 BCE. Between the summer solstice and the winter solstice, people from all around the periphery would gather at Stonehenge to create a series of temporary monuments dedicated to the ancestors of a Neolithic aristocracy. Perhaps during the season, there were stricter hierarchies between people and even a centralized organization of labor. We don't know for sure, but whatever centralized power existed, if it did not exist for very long before the site was empty for the other half of the year. So this is an interesting way in which they it wasn't some evolution to some other pattern. It was just that the patterns could coexist at different times at different places. After gathering, feasting, and building, they would again spread out into separate groups that all had a kind of tension and a certain type of size and a separate territory from one another, so that they weren't overlapping. So there's a kind of tensional relationship between these separate groups, and individuals within the groups were also free to leave and travel widely to join other groups. There is some archaeological evidence, but some of this is taken from modern hunter-gatherers, that one of the key features of these societies is the ability to leave. Also, you know, from migration studies, a really key aspect of global migration and a human right, which is not always appreciated, the right to leave a territory. Unfortunately, in the modern context, you do not have the right to arrive. That's not a human right to arrive anywhere, but it is your right to leave. So you end up with this kind of paradox. But in modern hunter-gatherer societies, the anthropological literature shows that one of the key features that makes these societies so adaptive, responsive to climatic changes, is that you could leave any one of the groups, and that the groups were very welcoming, again, probably not universal, but welcoming to new people. So the ability to leave and join is called scission and fusion in modern hunter-gatherer societies, but it essentially creates this kind of shifting metastable society. So there's a kind of elasticity of individuals and then a tension between the groups. To summarize, from the Upper Paleolithic to the Neolithic, hunter-gatherers alternated seasonally between four patterns of social motion without getting stuck in any particular pattern. This is not as historically as unusual as it may sound. Anthropological evidence from the Nambiquara in South America and the Kwakiutl on the Canada's northwest coast show that these groups adopted a similar series of seasonal patterns of social motion. So it's both historical and still in modern hunter-gatherers. However, over the Mesolithic, some human groups became increasingly stuck. So this term "stuck" is from David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, which if you've read that book, you can see that I'm taking some inspiration from their studies. It's an incredible book, not perfect, but really inspiring and suggestive. But they say the way they call it is stuck. So like that there's all these patterns and shifting in for hunter gatherers. There's a much more fluid shifting between all the patterns. And in human history, there's a kind of stuckness that people get trapped in Neolithic structures. And yeah, if you have questions about the origin of agriculture, I've just done a bunch of research on that. And I do think the word stuck is a pretty good word to describe that. And I have the studies to back this up in the citations, but I'll just say that from my research, looking back at that time period of the rise of agriculture, if it was ever possible for humans to hunt and gather or fish, that was always the preference. And the only reason in all the places where agriculture emerged independently in the world that humans ended up staying in the same place, storing food, and ultimately engaging in more agriculture was because of climate pressures. And if they didn't have those pressures, and in places where those pressures didn't exist, you do not get the emergence of Neolithic agriculture. Now, some degree of growing things, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about year-round occupation and growing. Anyway, we got stuck in agricultural villages, and eventually around 2000 BCE in Sumer, centralized organized political states. Again, there's a great story to tell there. There's a really great book called Against the Grain that tracks that specifically in Sumer. But the environmental and climatic changes really pushed that in a way that states were able to survive. I mean, the early states were built to help people survive really harsh conditions, because otherwise they were pretty awful. You wouldn't want to live in one of those places if you didn't have to. However, there's no historical necessity that all human societies must eventually become stuck in one pattern of motion. So in the history, in the figure, The Migrant, I tracked these patterns, but they're kind of dominant patterns over time where humans get stuck in these patterns for lots of reasons. There's also no reason why they must remain stuck in either hierarchical or egalitarian modes. So we can get, shifting back and forth. It's not like egalitarianism is some utopia that can never fall to hierarchy. Of course, hierarchy is sort of a built-in sort of tendency or something that can always emerge. In this ancient Chinese city of Taoxi in China, for example, there were the city rose from a small village in 2300 BCE to a powerfully hierarchical city with massive walls, roads, rigid segregation between elites and commoners, and a palace. 300 years later, there seems to have been a political revolution during which these hierarchical divisions were abandoned in favor of more egalitarian distributions that lasted 2 or 3 centuries. After this transition, the city's population even grew significantly, suggesting a relative social stability. In another example of such change, the ancient Mesoamerican city of Teotihuacan was largely authoritarian for 300 years before it suddenly shifted course around 300 CE to a more egalitarian distribution of quote of the city's resources and the establishment of kind of collective governance, end quote. That's from Graeber and Wengrow. In other words, almost as often as humans have settled down in prehistory and gotten stuck in agricultural villages or states, they've abandoned agriculture and the state. So it's not something like once you've got the state, it's some kind of evolutionary development and you're locked in. It can always shift and it can always go the other way. That is until the frequency of social pattern shifting began to slow down. So the patterns shift more often in the Paleolithic and then begin to kind of settle down and slow down and get stuck in these patterns over time. In some places, obviously differently than others. Specifically, more and more societies in the Near East began to stay in the same place for longer periods toward the end of the Neolithic, which we usually sometimes call like the beginning of civilization or whatever, but it's just a slowing down of these patterns that shift. Okay, that's it for that. Now, so I'm doing well on time. I just want to summarize because that was a lot, and I apologize for that, but it's a decade of work here I'm trying to summarize. And I will try to summarize it now to you in case that has all been a wash. 3 main points to take away from all of that. 3 kind of tentative theses based on the research. Number 1, the fractal migration. So I'm using the word fractal, but I just mean this sort of branching iterative pattern. The fractal migration of the earth and people is historically primary. contributing to the long-term planetary diversity and entropy. So just everything I was saying, like the planet is doing this, humans are doing this, everything is doing this branching iterative pattern, contributing to overall, and these patterns also produce quite a lot of diversity. And they also maximize entropy. And there's lots of other bits of evidence I could give you that shows that human diversity, cultural diversity, actually tend to congregate in places with ecological diversity, all of which increase the entropy of the planet. I didn't really say so much about the entropy of the planet, but if you want to know about the entropy of the planet, we can talk about it. So everything is contributing to that massive planetary system, and it's constitutive, meaning that migration is not some aberration or exception, or how do we deal with this problem? It's not a problem, it's a starting point. Yes, but so number two, as societies get stuck in various social patterns of motion, they end up producing particular migrant figures. These could be human, mainly I focused on human, but these could be non-human as well, who suffer proportionately along the axis of the great chain of being, with stasis at the top. So, I can't go into all this, but yeah, great people are going to suffer, migrants are going to suffer relative, and it's going to fall pretty predictably along the great chain of being, which is you've got at some kind of stasis at the top. Depends, you can pick your name for that, pure form, God, whatever it is, like absolute static, something that doesn't change at the top. And then on the very bottom is movement. So that's also historically why I was quite interested in movement, is thinking about that great chain of being and what it puts on the bottom. Last thesis. Today, the planet has largely got stuck in a single dominant form of motion. So lots of patterns out there, including all the historical ones. There's still hunter-gatherers, there's still farmers, there's still all these things. But I think it's fair to say that the dominant form of planetary motion right now is capitalism, which acts as a planetary cancer, directly or indirectly destroying its inhabitants as they're forced to move in the service of profit. The result is a 50% reduction. Again, I have the data and the citations if you want to talk about, but I have calculated this. I'm not just making this up. A 50% reduction in planetary entropy, that is since the Holocene. So capitalism is not fully responsible, but if you look in the last 30 years, it's pretty clear that capitalism is playing a really disproportionately destructive role in the reduction of planetary entropy, which is largely produced by deforestation. Fossil fuels, yes, but deforestation is really fundamental. In any case, massive destabilization and reduction of planetary entropy. But when the entropy of the planet begins to slow down, it's like when there's water that's flowing down a drain and it's producing a little vortex, as that the vortex is the metastable pattern that emerges when you've got a continuous flow of energy. Here. And that is the situation on the planet, is that we are slowing the process down. And by the process, I mean like energy from the sun hitting the earth, being broken down and radiated into space as heat. That's the bigger picture of what's happening. Sorry, this is like bigger picture even than you thought. You're like, oh, I thought big picture was going to be like the globe. No, deep planetary history. This is the bigger picture of human migration, of social structures, and their relationship to the planetary system. It's destabilizing it. Right. Yeah. So reduction, this whole process is destabilizing, planetary entropy and undermining, the Earth system unless we stop. Thank you for your patience.